Welcome to Taiwan Report News Brief, news, analysis, and context from Taichung, Taiwan. I'm Donovan Smith. All right, both the Taiwan People's Party and their chair, Taipei Mayor Ko Wen-je, have been in the news a fair bit recently. On a practical level, they're going to begin charging a membership fee of 500 NT, which should help raise the millions of NT for the party. This is a sensible development, as they need funding to develop their party going forward. The third largest party in the legislature, they have been somewhat unformed and unclear entity, without a clear identity outside of being somewhere vaguely between the DPP and KMT, and in favor of good government and rational policy, which is a bit like saying they like moms and beef noodles. That is slowly changing, however, as the TPP Legislative Caucus has been active on laying out policy positions on issues like housing, labor, and their stances on the upcoming referendums in August. Without going into the details, their positions are generally rational, coherent, and often somewhat different than what the KMT and DPP, though how much one agrees with their positions will of course vary by political ideology. There is a problem with this, however. For the most part, their stances on domestic issues, along with those of the DPP and KMT, aren't all that dramatically different. In practice, the bureaucracy largely drives the domestic agenda, regardless of which party is in power, with the parties mostly just tinkering with the branding of the initiatives and the weighting of priorities. Many of President Tsai's initiatives are packed with rebranded President Ma-era initiatives, who in turn repackaged Chen-era plans, and so on. It's also not uncommon for the DPP and KMT to swap issues once in power. Now, one upshot of this is that it is difficult for political parties to use domestic policies to differentiate themselves without making a radical break from existing norms. The new power party, in some cases, has tried to do so, but in general, none of the bigger parties have proposed much that is particularly radical or dramatically different, including the TPP. The main issues where the parties differentiate themselves in Taiwan are on China relations, national identity, and foreign affairs. In the last election, the TPP officially more or less copied the DPP line, which makes sense as the DPP currently occupies the center in terms of public opinion on those issues. It is in this context that some recent moves by Party Chair Ke has been rocking the boat. He said that the party should not get too bogged down in the independence versus unification debate and instead should find an alternative centerpiece issue different from those of the pan-blue or pan-green camps. In Kaohsiung, he doubled down. The confrontations over the decades between groups that support independence and those backing unification with China are meaningless, and the TPP takes the middle road. That is a staggering statement on many levels. In Taiwan politics, it is the most central issue and is by far the most defining characteristic of any party. In other words, there is no way that this issue can't be a centerpiece issue in national level elections. It may be possible to dodge the issue in local elections, but on the national level, voters want to know if the party is pro-Taiwan or believes in eventual annexation by China. The issue is existential to Taiwan's future. The People's Republic has made no bones about its intent to annex Taiwan by force if necessary, and recently it has been making threatening military moves. Probably Ke's intent was to appeal to middle-of-the-road voters or light blue voters who dislike the DPP, and he has, in the past, tried to float ideas on coming up with a new formulation for relations with China outside of the deeply unpopular 1992 consensus. The problem for Ke is that in the current climate, there is no longer much wiggle room to work with. Beijing has stated bluntly and clearly that without the, as they term it, Taiwan authorities accepting the 92 consensus, there will be no talks between the two sides. Period. no middle road. Then things got even weirder. Ke posted a personal video, not a TPP or Taipei city government video, on a Facebook page devoted to fans of Ke. And here is how the Taipei Times described it. Describing the legislature in Taipei as surrounded by a Chinatown, Ke in a Facebook video on Thursday highlighted that many streets in the city are named after places across the Taiwan Strait, including Qingdao, Hangzhou, Tianjin, Nanjing, and Guangzhou. A certain political party has been presenting itself as the local party, sporting phrases such as Taiwan consciousness, but its headquarters are on Beiping East Road, Ke said, referring to the Democratic Progressive Party without directly mentioning it. Don't you think that's weird? He asked. Ke, chairman of the Taiwan People's Party, urged the central government to rename the streets to better reflect a Taiwan spirit. 3 notes here. Beiping is an old name for Beijing used when it wasn't the capital, and the KMT's capital was in Nanjing. And the Taipei street names referencing places in China actually roughly forms a map of China. Also noticed he referred to the DPP as promoting Taiwan consciousness, while he himself chose to promote the phrasing Taiwan spirit. The video was a disaster, and it was pulled down after 4 hours. He was widely ridiculed for the video because the responsibility for changing the street names in Taipei does not lie with the central government. It lies with the city government, of which he is the mayor. In short, he was advocating for something he could have enacted at any time if he'd wanted to in either his first term or during his second term up to now. Ke has been trying to position the TPP as a more pro-Taiwan party than the KMT, but less ideological than the DPP on national identity issues. See the consciousness versus spirit phrasing just noted. Now that makes some sense politically. There is a swathe of the voting public that probably desires just such a party. Light blues, uncomfortable with the KMT's pro-China positions, conservative DPP supporters, and those who grew up under martial law in the later stages during the economic boom and don't see the ROC as all bad, but still identify as Taiwanese, are all potential constituencies. However, in his attempt to chart a middle ground on dealing with China on the one hand, and in decrying the KMT's turning Taipei into a cartographic homage to China, he ended up landing 2 punches right into his own face. In short, he handled both extremely poorly. There was another mistake he made on changing the street names as well. In theory, it sounds like a reasonable idea to change the street names to something more pro-Taiwan. Though notice he dodged the issues of all the street names dedicated to the KMT specifically, like streets named after Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen, and the KMT ideology of the 3 principles of the people. The problem is, changing them all at once would be hugely unpopular. Changing street names is very costly and causes a lot of confusion, and even some strongly pro-Taiwan voters would oppose it. For example, here in Taichung, changing a continuous stretch of road that included the former Taichung Harbor Road to Taiwan Boulevard caused an uproar, in spite of it logically making some sense. The cost to Taipei in terms of street signs and address plaques, the cost to change maps, name cards, brochures tied to the original addresses, and so on, plus the confusion caused by having to remember a slew of new street names one has grown up with, makes it a practical nightmare. If he were to try and implement this, the most practical route might be to slowly implement changes over a longer period of time, and signaled well in advance. However, considering the embarrassment he's already suffered over the issue, and considering he's only got a year and a half left in his term, it seems unlikely he's going to make any significant moves on the issue. Now, to wrap up, what are the prospects for the TPP and Ko? For the TPP as a whole, they seem to be moving in the right direction, solidifying themselves as a party and working toward building a unique identity. How much that identity will appeal to the public going forward is hard to say, but there is a block of voters who are fed up with both the DPP and the KMT they can appeal to. They have been opening offices around the country and have been setting themselves modest goals of winning a few council seats here and there. In the local elections in 2022, barring widespread defections from other parties, such as the KMT, they aren't likely to make too much headway. Though the KMT is struggling on the national level, they still have considerable electoral muscle at the local level, where their unpopular ideology on China and Taiwan are less relevant than potholes and the price of cable. The TPP, unlike the KMT and the DPP, is starting from scratch and will most likely be fielding largely unknown candidates lacking experience, connections, and much in the way of funding. The big test will be in 2024. In the last election, they failed to win any district seats, but they won 5 seats entirely through allocated party list voting, meaning they were able to attract enough people to vote for them as a party to qualify them for legislative seats, even if none of their candidates won seats directly. That is entirely possible again next time. But the real test of the party is if they can win some seats outright with strong candidates. Not much sign of that yet, but they could develop some, or defectors from other parties could join them, especially if there's discord in the KMT. Ko has already said he is interested in running for president in 2024, but he qualified it by noting that only if the opinion polls gave him a shot at it. In Taipei, his approval has tanked, and recently has been languishing near or at the bottom of rankings of all mayors and commissioners in the country. Taipei seems to be rather fed up with him, and the pox on all your houses voters who disliked politics as usual have abandoned him in large numbers. However, nationally, he seems to be more popular, with one TVPS poll recently ranking him as the number 5 politician nationally, and other polls with him in the top 10. He will be term limited out in 2022, which will give him a chance to focus on improving his performance for 2024, and by then, Taipei may be more forgiving. Or they may not. He has a tendency towards chronic foot and mouth disease, and that may continue to remind Taipei residents what they didn't like about him the first time round. He'll also have to clarify his stance on China and Taiwan into something that the public can accept, which up to now he's failed to do to barely anyone's satisfaction. As Taipei City Mayor, he can get away with that. But the nation will be looking very, very closely at what the presidential candidates think on the issue. And if they don't trust or like what they see, this single issue will sink his chances. The TPP and Mayor Ko are still players in the game, but they have a lot of work ahead of them to effectively compete with the DPP or KMT. All right, that's it for the program. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been making some changes to a format to the shows here. A lot more analysis and context, even in Taiwan headlines, than previously, and going into a deeper dive here on Taiwan Report News Brief. I hope you like the new format. I'm hoping that the analysis and context gives you a little bit more to think about going about your day. All right, be sure to support us if you can, and if it's all possible. Support us as a patron on patreon.com/Taiwan Report. It really does help us here at Taiwan Report keep this project going. And of course, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, be sure to hit like and subscribe, and on YouTube, hit that little bell so you get notifications. All right, till next time, tune in again.
This has been brought to you by the Taiwan Report. For more content like this, become our patron at report.tw.
还有就是那个台湾狗啦，最喜欢我的台湾狗了。